Let's look at other news now. The South African International Relations Minister has told SABC that parts of the world are facing a very phenomenal challenge to mitigate the effects of climate change. Naledi Pandor was speaking at the conclusion of the summit for a new Global Financial Pact out in Paris, where she said that African leaders had been very clear about areas of international development and financing they felt needed to be improved. Minister Pandor also addressed concerns surrounding the upcoming BRICS summit here in South Africa. She was talking to our correspondent Ross Cullen out in the French capital.
Did South Africa achieve all the objectives that it set out at the start of this summit?
Well, I think that we were a part of the summit, following up from the previous summit that really looked at financing. The issue at the time was post-COVID-19 and the challenge of recovery of the economies of developing countries, particularly Africa. And what was discussed at the time was the role of the multilateral finance institutions and their ability to ensure sufficient liquidity to African countries to address the economic problems that were challenging them at that particular period in 2021. So I'm glad there's been a follow-up, and that at this summit, the whole issue of the restructuring of multilateral finance institutions has come up very strongly and almost been agreed upon. I felt that there wasn't sufficient substance with respect to exactly what in concrete terms was meant by reform, but I think inequity in terms of access to financing, as well as insufficient decision-making ability on the part of developing countries. These were clear elements that kept being referred to by various African leaders. But I don't think we signed off on an agreement that stipulated the nature of transformation. What there is progress on is financing of climate change responses, mitigation, adaptation, and very strong voices on what needs to be done, and the fact that the world needs to work together on a set of comprehensive responses to the impact of climate change. And I think very clear stress on the urgency for developing countries, especially the small island developing states, which are really facing a very phenomenal problem insofar as the impacts of climate change are concerned.
You mentioned a lack of substance in some of the discussions, Minister. Does that mean that we would have to have further summits down the line? Can you just describe and explain a little bit more by what you mean about lack of substance?
Well, firstly, this summit is convened by France, which is a member state of the UN system. You have other member states, so all of us are equally represented in multilateral institutions, but very clearly developed countries enjoying far greater influence and power insofar as multilateral development finance institutions are concerned. But also developed countries have taken on a large number of responsibilities that have been outcomes of previous climate conferences. This summit is not a decision-making body. It's not a UN conference, so there isn't force and effect coming out of here. But I think very clear sentiments and a real sense of agreement, that we need to move more urgently, that we have to become more concrete. And I think a specificity we haven't seen before from African leaders about what they believe should be done and areas that they believe have been left unattended over several decades of international conferences of a similar kind.
Mia Motley from Barbados said she didn't want to see action in weeks or months. It's needed now. Can you sympathise with that point of view that we don't need more action in late weeks or months or a further point in the future? It needs to happen now.
Oh, absolutely. I think for them it's an existential a challenge because as we speak, they're experiencing terrible flooding. This is a regular occurrence for island states such as the one she governs. So clearly for them, it's life and death. And we have to become, the world has to become more responsive, those with money, those with technology, those with influence need to do much more than articulating good sounding conclusions and statements. And I felt that she now wants to see the finance really come through.
Just domestically, President Ramaphosa has spoken about the energy challenges back in South Africa, the aspiration for a just energy transition. Do you think that we'll see the impact back home of any of the issues that have been discussed at this summit?
Well, fortunately, South Africa is already acting. As you know, we have a really awful crisis of electricity availability, but there are plans in place and we've begun to see the impact of some of those plans. There is going to be more renewable energy available to the country. Action is being taken to ensure regular maintenance of our power stations, and we do know that there is an effort by government, particularly through the Minister of Electricity, to address this very, very worrying problem of electricity availability. This week, South Africa's had, I think, really good commitment from countries of the West. We had commitments to renewable energy resources from Denmark and the Netherlands, both of whom are now becoming part of the joint energy transition process. Then, of course, we have the 5-partner commitment to the JETP, which was initiated in Glasgow at COP26. So I think South Africa comes out of this with assurance that the JETP continues to receive attention. What we need to do when we get back home is actually look at where we are in terms of the phases and ensure that we build up a momentum that convinces the partners that they should, one, ensure that they meet their financial commitments, but two, that they are a regular party to each of the activities associated with the JETP.
On the BRICS summit in August, there is discussions around the possible attendance of Vladimir Putin and some of the issues that might prove complicated or difficult for South Africa to manage. What's your understanding of that protocol surrounding a possible visit by the Russian leader?
Well, let me deal with that which I'm sure of. There will be a summit of BRICS in South Africa, in Johannesburg. As to the matter of President Putin, as I've said, the person inviting is President Ramaphosa. So I would want him to speak on the matter of the attendance of President Putin. But a physical summit in South Africa is, I believe, a very important part of the BRICS calendar and must happen.